Good afternoon and welcome to this lecture. My name is Markus Stock and I'm the principal of University College. I'm also a professor of German and medieval studies here at U of T. I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I ask all of you to take a moment to reflect on Indigenous histories of the land upon which you live and work, wherever you are situated right now. University College is very pleased to hold this lecture. The bricks and mortar of our building embody a colonial past, but also enclose a tentative, hopeful present. That forming partnerships between non-Indigenous and Indigenous students, staff, and colleagues, providing a welcoming space for everyone, and using what we do well, intellectual inquiry, would enable us to find a way forward in this fraught moment on this land, 7 years and counting after the release of the TRC calls to action. The college has made steps to raise the profile of contemporary Indigenous artists, such as the display of Dana Claxton's 218 work, Red on Red, Ode to Gramsci, in UC's East Wing. If you're here with us right now, and if you're leaving the building on the east side, do check out Claxton's banners when you leave the building over there. UC also made scholarships for Indigenous and Black students one of our prime fundraising priorities, and alumni and friends have marvelously heeded our call in this respect. And we are also committed to contributing to the study of historical facts about the institutional complicity in genocidal colonial practices. Being conscious of and knowing about U of T's institutional past is key to understanding our institutional present moment, which has to rely on striving for factual accuracy and acknowledging historical truths. In this context, we can all agree that historians have hardly ever been more relevant in Canada. And on behalf of the college, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Caitlin Harvey, postdoctoral fellow at Fitzwilliam College, University of Cambridge, who will deliver this afternoon's lecture. It is entitled University Land Grabs, Indigenous Dispossession, and the University of Toronto. We are very much looking forward to the talk that our guest will be delivering this afternoon. Some quick housekeeping notes. This is a hybrid event. The lecture will be live recorded. The lecture will be followed by a Q&A. Questions posed by the live audience will be repeated so that they can be heard by our online audience. So please, those of you here, keep your questions and comments succinct and on the brief side. For those attending virtually, live closed captioning is available for the event. The option can be turned on by clicking the closed captioning icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen to submit your questions, which will be monitored here and brought to our live moderator's attention. I now call upon my colleague, Professor Emily Gilbert, Vice Principal of University College and a Professor in Canadian Studies and Geography and Planning, to more formally introduce our speaker.
Great, thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to do a formal introduction of Dr. Caitlin Harvey. So Dr. Caitlin Harvey is an early career research fellow at Fitzwilliam College, University of Cambridge. Her research examines the history of migration, race, settlement, and education in a British imperial and global context. Her scholarly interests also include Indigenous history and the institutional and political development of settler Indigenous societies since 1800, She holds a PhD in history from Princeton University, as well as degrees from the University of Oxford and closer to here at the University of Western Ontario. Her current book project, Bricks and Mortarboards, University Building in the Settlement Empire, 1840 to 1920, examines the rapid expansion of university education across Britain's colonies of settlement and their self-governing successors, so Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, and the United States. Her research has been published in the Journal of Women's History, the Pacific Northwest Quarterly, and the Native American and Indigenous Studies Journal. And I'd just like to mention this article that came in that last journal entitled The Wealth of Knowledge, Land Grab Universities in a British Imperial and Global Context, which is the article that I read, which first taught me about the work that Caitlin is doing. And it's on land grabs across many countries, but including Canada, there's a significant amount, as well as U of T specifically. And as Caitlin notes in there, King's College, which was a precursor to the University of Toronto, received one of the earliest educational land grants in British North America in 1828. So I'm not going to go into that in any more detail. That's what we have Dr. Harvey here for. But I mention it because if you want to follow up on any of the information that you hear today, there is a written version that has some additional information that you might want to look at. And I also wanted to mention this piece because it's been really crucial to us here at University College as we're trying to think more deeply and carefully about the college's complicity in colonialism and the appropriation of land. And as we strive to work towards better futures, thinking about that past and its legacy in the present and some of the ongoing challenges. But with that, I will stop talking because we're all here to hear Dr. Caitlin Harvey. And so I'll hand it over to you. Thank you so much.
Great, can everyone hear me? Is this on? All the way at the back? Great. So I'll start off by thanking Emily Gilbert, who organized this event, and also University College for hosting it. And of course, thank you to all of you for attending, those in person and those online. Could I click? So I want to open today by considering the University of Toronto's and also University College's land acknowledgement. The acknowledgement recognizes the university's use of the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, connecting Toronto's campuses to the Indigenous lands they occupy. I want to suggest, however, that insofar as the acknowledgement represents the Indigenous lands that were and are crucial to the university's development, a more accurate land acknowledgement for the University of Toronto might instead recognize the Adirondack, the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Petun, Algonquin, and of course, the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, among possibly others. At one level, the purpose of this talk is to demonstrate why Indigenous territories located far from Toronto might be included in its land acknowledgement. But perhaps more importantly, this talk will explore how the University of Toronto and other institutions like it came to control so much land in the 19th century. Like many institutions of higher learning and settler societies, Toronto's university began as a large-scale landowner. In 1828, the university's predecessor, King's College, which Emily just mentioned, received more than 200,000 acres of expropriated Indigenous land. And that area is larger than the present-day city of Toronto. This land, through its lease, mortgage, or sale, then supplied the bulk of the young institution's endowment capital. Despite its import to the institution and to Indigenous communities, the extent of university landholding has often been missed, and this has occurred, of course, not only at Toronto. One reason for the omission is that the land parcels assigned to universities by their governments were scattered over great distances and were both larger than and distinct from their campuses. A second reason remains that we tend to think today of universities as fixed place-based communities. If a traveler, for instance, asked where she could find the University of Toronto, we wouldn't direct her to London or Kingston or Wilmot or Norwich. But in the 19th century, that traveler would find lands belonging to Toronto's university in all of these places and in many more besides. In the estimation of the Royal Commissioners who reported on the University of Toronto in 1906, it was landholding that had transformed the landscape of higher education both across Ontario and beyond it. Throughout North America, they wrote, little in the financial history of universities has been more noticeable than the good effect of large grants of wild, meaning Indigenous land. The original grant to the University of Toronto has borne abundant fruit, has indeed made the present state of higher education in Ontario possible. It does not therefore seem unreasonable to express the hope that at least 1 million acres will be set aside for the university and University College. In the statement, the commissioners reveal not only the import of the university's original early 19th century grant. In addition, their professed hope of acquiring a further 1 million acres, more than 4 times the original grant and 80 years after it, also it suggests the enduring appeal of using land as an institutional financing mechanism. A further 1 million acres for the university did not materialize. Nevertheless, at the time of this commission, Toronto's institution was still engaged in managing its initial endowment. So in what follows, I'll trace the relationship between Indigenous dispossession and university building in the 100 years before the Royal Commission on the University of Toronto in 1906. And you can see some of those land parcels. This is a land parcel map, are blacked, are the shaded out portions. From Toronto, or York, as it was then known, I'll then move outward to explore institutional financing through Indigenous land as a broader pattern of university development, one that funded other universities in Canada and across the globe. In doing so, I offered 2 arguments. The first is that a common mechanism through which settler governments financed universities in the 19th century was land. Land leases, mortgages, and using land as collateral for loans were not the only financing strategies of public universities, but they were significant ones. Huge swaths of the land granted to universities across Anglo-American colonies of settlement, however, had not been ceded by Indigenous peoples. These lands reassignment thus represented an enormous wealth transfer from Indigenous communities to universities, making them the beneficiaries of Indigenous removal. And secondly, or my second argument, new public universities were not neutral knowledge-producing institutions. Long after the Commission of 1906, these organizations would transform their physical environments because they came to control knowledge production about land. Many universities with land endowments, including Toronto, institutionalized one form of knowledge about land cultivation, which was based upon the growing field of European agricultural science, while leaving aside Indigenous ways of being and thinking about land. The effect of this knowledge valuation is still felt today. New seed varietals, the introduction of herd animals to non-native environments, the invention of improved fertilizers, and other university invented techniques altered local ecologies in line with settler knowledge systems and desires. So recent historical research, especially the influential Land Grab Universities project of one of my colleagues at Cambridge, Bobby Lee, and the journalist Tristan Atone, has traced the colonial legacy of the American land-grant university. Lee and Atone's project locates the Indigenous land apportioned to US states to fund higher education under the Morrill Act of 1862. Altogether, the Morrill Act supplied land-grant universities with over 10 million acres, which is more land than exists in the states of Vermont, Connecticut, and Delaware put together. Yet the American Morrill Act was not the only grant of Indigenous land made to fund higher education in the United States or in settler colonies worldwide. Especially among British colonies of settlement, Indigenous dispossession formed a common financing strategy for endowing institutions. In addition, and invigorated by popular interest in the legacies of empire, scholars and university administrators today have looked more self-critically at their institutions' histories. Higher education's connections to colonial wealth have been at the heart of this renewed interest. Not only Indigenous land, but projects excavating the ties of slave profits to university building, including those of the historians Craig Stephen Wilder and Nicholas Draper, have burgeoned. Histories of the University of Toronto, too, have noted its landholding. But it's difficult to understand the significance of university landholding at Toronto without looking at the practice in its regional and imperial context. Although Toronto's landholding was distinctive, it was not anomalous. For this reason, there's a great deal more to uncover about the practices of Indigenous dispossession that undergirded university building in the 19th century, and I know many of you in this room are engaged in that project. So with a few exceptions, including the University College London, which began as a joint stock company, there were three main mechanisms of mid-Victorian university financing. These mechanisms could be and were often combined. Although many universities had hoped to achieve self-sufficiency through student fees, in reality, this was not a possibility for almost any public university before 1900. Instead, educationalists sought out a public or government grant, land grants from their governments or clergy reserves that could be sold off to yield an endowment, and benefactions, usually from wealthy citizens. In some cases, one of these revenue streams dominated, especially in an institution's initial capital-intensive years of development. McGill University, for example, took its name from its first benefactor, a businessman with ventures in furs, but also in enslaved peoples. Convinced of the need for Protestant higher education in the heart of Catholic Lower Canada, James McGill left $50,000 in 1813 for an institution that still bears his name in Montreal. By 1865, the governors of McGill College had determined that, quote, this endowment, liberal as it was yet quite inadequate for the object contemplated. Fortunately for these governors, the college continued to receive funds from both its provincial legislative assembly, as well as major donations from the tobacco magnate, Sir William MacDonald, the businessman, Sir Donald A. Smith, or the Lord Strathcona, the beer manufacturing Molson family, and eventually the steel manufacturer, Andrew Carnegie. A little earlier in the Maritimes, it was government grants that allowed for a wave of sectarian universities to sweep across Canada's east coast. Hoping to transplant a Church of England institution to colonial soil, the British government spent over £37,000 to fund the Anglican King's College, Windsor, between 1790 and 1834, an iteration, of course, which still exists. Nova Scotia's House of Assembly would subsequently outdo this level of support. Until 1881, it supported 6 universities in Nova Scotia, as well as the Methodist Mount Allison University, despite that it was located in the neighboring province of New Brunswick. While these East Coast institutions all survived their precarious infancy, most 19th century universities spent their first few decades without an endowment and one financial shock away from ruin. The lived conditions of settler societies produced various sources of financial precarity, from credit crises to cholera epidemics. Queen's University at Kingston, for example, nearly collapsed when the commercial bank failed in 1878. A single donor, who was also Canada's first Black lawyer, saved the institution from, quote, oblivion. This donor, Robert Sutherland, left his entire estate, valued at 11 to 12,000 Canadian dollars, to his alma mater, and that sum was equivalent to about a year's worth of operating expenses. Meanwhile, the many immediate practical and infrastructural needs of universities often meant that there was a significant lag between an institution's establishment and its opening. The King's College at York, Toronto, for instance, received its charter in 1827, although it did not welcome a single undergraduate until the 1840s. During this time, land featured prominently among the financing mechanisms contemplated for ensuring the college's long-term financial stability. Without a significant initial donor, the Anglican clergyman John Strawn wrote in 1827 that revenue for a new university will be found from, quote, the sale of lands appropriated for its endowment or grants from the provincial legislature. Especially among cash-poor governments then, or just cash-strapped governments, including the Upper Canadian legislature in the early 19th century, the use of land as a financial tool rather than direct cash grants was a recurring theme. As a mechanism of institutional financing, though, land granting was neither particular to universities nor to the 19th century. Colonial and settler governments had relied upon grants of Indigenous land to fund railways, turnpikes, canals, and other public projects since the 1600s. The relationship between universities and landholding in Europe, moreover, had an even longer association. In England, the ancient universities of Oxford and Cambridge had long depended upon the rental income generated by landholding. The Oxbridge colleges, even today, quote, are among the largest institutional landowners in land-scarce England. When university promoters and settler societies advocated the use of land grants then, they invoked a European custom. Transplanted to new environments, however, university administrators would carry on this custom on a larger and more devastating scale. So like many colonial institutions, the University of Toronto emerged out of religious rivalries as the relationship between colonial churches, settler states, and higher education shifted in the 19th century. Religious boosterism in higher education, as previously described, had already inspired university expansion in the Maritimes. As late as 1922, Maclean's magazine described the Maritime provinces as having, quote, more colleges per head of population than in almost any other section of the globe. The rate of university building across Canada, in fact, far exceeded public demand for higher education. It also greatly surpassed the provision of elementary and secondary schooling. Nonetheless, the desire to form faith-based institutions that might train clergymen, including Indigenous clergymen, and teachers held consistent throughout the Victorian period. In Canada, university expansion also gained momentum from anti-American impulses, and among some, the aspiration to replant English social and ecclesiastical hierarchies abroad. The Eton and Oxford educated Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe first favored a college for the Upper Canadian colony in the late 18th century. In 1798, the Upper Canadian legislature made its first provision for such an institution. As a later Royal Commission tells us, in that year, quote, a grant of 549,000 acres was, at the instance of the provincial legislature, placed at the disposal of the local authorities for the maintenance of various educational establishments, including a university. Between 1798 and 1826, the provincial government then assigned about 190,000 acres of this endowment to a public body, which was known as the Board of General Education, and it funded grammar and common schools. At this point, a new Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, appointed in 1818, stepped in. The soldier and colonial administrator, Sir Peregrine Maitland, agreed with elite Anglican educationalists, especially the eventual Bishop of Toronto, John Strachan, that a new Anglican university would require more valuable lands to be viable. Maitland thus negotiated a lucrative exchange with the colonial secretary in 1825. According to the deed of endowment of King's College, which was signed on January 3rd, 1828, this exchange amounted to trading the remainder of the 1798 land grant for 225,944 acres of higher valued Crown reserves. Although various college bursars chronically mismanaged these lands, the Indigenous lands eventually assigned to the university comprised between 223 and 226,000 acres. University administrators and professors then selected institutional parcels over the next decade. Documentation of these selections still exists in Toronto's Office of the Chief Accountant records under the heading Maps of University Endowment Lands. So there are several ways to assess the use and value of endowment lands to the university, none of which fully capture the significance of their loss to Indigenous communities. Perhaps the most obvious way to study these lands is to examine where they were located and when they were sold. Until the formation of the University of Toronto in 1850, the King's College Council formally managed the institution's land endowment. In practice, however, the task of selecting and selling land was managed by the college bursar. With little formal training in accounting, this position was held first by an army officer, Colonel Joseph Wells, from 1827 to 1839, followed by the surgeon Henry Boys until 1850. While both men made significant financial gains for King's College from its land endowment, they also provided large unsecured loans to university administrators from endowment funds, most famously to the Bishop Strachan. They failed to collect monies from land rents or sale, and they did little to prevent land speculation, indeed sometimes engaging in it themselves. As one of the first professors at Toronto's University, John Langton, remarked in 1856, the endowment was, quote, for 25 years and more, a perfect mine of wealth for speculators. So looking at the actions of these bursars and their fellow administrators reveals that the new institution's land transactions extended across hundreds of Upper Canadian townships. And this gives you a sense of when, for the first section of lands, they were sold. Over 135,000 acres had been sold by 1848, for instance, which were located across 102 townships. At the same time, the King's College bursar, Colonel Wells, had also been tasked with managing the accounts of a new preparatory school named Upper Canada College. Founded by the provincial government in 1829, the Upper Canada College was meant to supply the province's desperate lack of preparatory schools, colleges, and academies, as well as, of course, to serve as a feeder school to King's College. Like other universities and settler societies, Toronto staff became directly involved in managing secondary schools that might channel students into their institutions. Accordingly, when this new Upper Canada College received its own Indigenous land endowment of 66,000 acres spread across 20 townships, it was Wells, the bursar of King's College, who also managed these lands. So tracing the land transactions, that's grown a little bit. Tracing the land transactions that form these endowments is difficult, especially because college maps and surveys were often poorly made and inexact. However, by applying a combination of archival and digital methods to these transactions, including basic georeferencing, we can get a sense of how Indigenous lands distant from the university played a pivotal role in their development. So we'll consider, for example, the region with the largest number of land sales by 1848, which, as you can see here, is Wilmot. And all of the ones that are small aren't all of the different townships involved, but they're ones that had over 1,000 acres sold by 1848. So two bursars of King's College managed and sold lands in Wilmot between 1830 and 1847, making the largest single sale of 12,300 acres in 1835. From the university's endowment maps and King's College land ledgers, the location of these lands within Wilmot is discernible. This is the first sort of map, as you can see. The land selected amounted to 21,300 acres surrounding 3 roads, which were Herbs, Snyder, and Bleams. Land reserves held by the Canada Company and clergy reserves identified as Six Nations land enclosed the parcels, of which 19,425 acres had been sold by 1848. And you can see the shaded regions are those selected parcels. So by georeferencing these historical maps using QGIS, we can then visualize those 19th century parcels on a contemporary map. As a final step, the georeference maps highlight the traditional territories of the Indigenous nations whose dispossession made this university landholding and financing possible. And here's just a slightly enhanced or different version. As is shown by the maps provided, the Wilmot endowment lands cross the territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee. The Digital History Project, Native Land Digital, provides the approximate locations of these Indigenous territories along with the treaties that govern them. In this instance, the Haldimand Treaty covers the Wilmot lands. In 1784, the first iteration of the Haldimand Treaty directed the purchase of approximately 385,000 hectares of Mississauga land in exchange for a little over 1,100 pounds. Colonial authorities then transferred some of these hectares to the Haudenosaunee in return for their military service to the British Crown. Subsequent diminutions of this land and alterations to the treaty remain disputed. And just to give you an example, so a fairly large regional map can again be digitized over top or overlaying a map. And I'm sure some of the geographers in the room can do this with even more exactness. So another way of assessing the value of these lands to the growing university is by considering their monetary contributions to its endowment. At mid-century, the average price per acre of land sold before 1848 was £1, 4 shillings, and 3.5 pence. Based on this average pricing, land sales and alienation within Wilmot amounted to £23,375, which is greater than about a year's worth of operating expenses. The practice of tracing land sales by region or township and of georeferencing surveyed land parcels can be repeated for nearly all Indigenous land endowments selected before 1848. With the formation of both University College and the University of Toronto, a new University Board of Endowment managed the institution's lands after 1850. Much like the machinations of university building in the Maritimes, a university's development in Toronto grew out of the rubble of a 25-year sectarian clash over the Anglican King's College. This clash continued even after the new non-sectarian university's establishment, and before it had stimulated the creation of at least 3 other bodies of higher learning, being the Methodist Victoria College at Coburg, Catholics Regiopolis College, arguably another, Presbyterians Queen's College at Kingston, which was not to mention, of course, Trinity College. All of these institutions, including the non-denominational University College, angled for a stake in the land endowments held by Toronto's Board of Endowment. Yet not all of them were successful. The newly formed University of Toronto was an examining body meant to certify degrees, while colleges retained the responsibility of teaching undergraduates. Based on this arrangement, affiliated colleges could make claims upon the university's surplus income fund, even while receiving separate legislative grants, and would be represented on the university senate. In practice, however, collegiate financing was complex. In particular, for an institution that held its meetings in Toronto, University College often found itself with many more representatives present than other colleges. A financial report on the university completed in 1862 noted, for instance, quote, while other colleges have only 1 member to represent them, University College has 5 members with seats at the board. The practical effect of the system has been, in a measure, to give the control to University College. The power of University College members over institutional governance, therefore, also gave this college disproportionate influence over the university's endowment lands and funds. Between 1854 and 1857, the unevenly weighted Board of Endowment and new bursar approved the sale of, quote, upwards of £140,000 worth of land. At its previous transactions, this meant that by 1862, the University of Toronto had contracted sales of Indigenous land worth over 1.3 million Canadian dollars, corresponding to about 207,000 acres. And that's about $40 to $50 million today. About $1 million of this amount had been collected, with $300,000 outstanding. The significance of these land sales to the size of the endowment is suggested by the bursar's valuation of the total endowment 1 year before, in 1861, as just $900,000. In the hands of the University Senate, a substantial proportion of these monies were then allocated to various building projects, especially to those on its main campus. One critique launched by the authors of the 1862 report on the university was that its Senate had approved building projects that threatened the endowment's permanence. Quote, the chief diminution of the endowment, they argued, has arisen from the large expenditure on the new university and college buildings, museums, and library. And this amounted to about $400,000. In another section of this report, moreover, its authors contended that, quote, the current expenses of University College are much greater than is necessary, so that a large amount of the said university income fund is annually wasted and misapplied, and other academical institutions in Upper Canada are deprived of the benefit of any surplus. Although further conclusions could be made about the appropriateness of university expenditures, the significance of Indigenous land to building the University of Toronto as a bricks and mortar institution seems apparent. So land, not only at Toronto, could be a cumbersome asset to manage. If it was not sold as scrip, and this actually isn't Toronto scrip in this example, but it is an example of land scrip, and scrip functioned as a promissory note for the asset itself. So if this wasn't done, then tracts had to be located, sections of land leased or sold, and management costs paid. In some cases, an agricultural board or government legislature managed the lands on behalf of the university. But in other instances, as one professor described the University of Toronto at mid-century, quote, the professors who formed the Senate found all their time occupied in managing the selling and leasing of the lands and disentangling the immense mass of speculation which had existed. Over time, most new institutions of higher education came to favor government cash grants. Yet whether land alone could sustain universities financially did not mitigate the effects of its redistribution for those who gained or lost access to land. And the knock-on effects that often accompanied a land grant, such as private gifts and public money, could be considerable. So the appeal of using Indigenous land to fund universities extended beyond Toronto. In fact, whether facilitated by imperial networks or mandated by legislatures, knowledge sharing and the founding documents of one colonial university often influenced the formation of another. An important reformer in the history of the University of Sydney in Australia, for example, suggestively noted the 226,000 acres given to King's College, Toronto, in the Sydney Morning Herald in 1849. In Manitoba, 30 years later, politicians and reformers looked to the Constitution of the University of Toronto to understand how their 3 denominational colleges might become a part of a non-denominational university. Following Canadian Confederation in 1867, Western Canadian universities, the University of Manitoba among them, would repeat the pattern of institutional financing set in Toronto and by then also in the United States. Established in part due to the threat of armed rebellion by the Métis and their allies, the province of Manitoba entered the Confederation in 1870, establishing a provincial university in 1877. Manitoba's provincial government then endowed its new university with 150,000 acres of recently dispossessed Indigenous land. Although provincial legislators offered to select lands on behalf of the institution, university administrators insisted that, quote, their own miniature land department, end quote, would best serve their interests. After finalizing its acres in 1891, the land board served as a type of land bank. It offered loans to agriculturalists using its collateral, secured mortgages, and it relied on land agents to rent or sell property on favorable terms, so slightly different from the bursar model. Land purchases were often small. Farmers and farmers' wives, such as Sarah Braithwaite of Portage la Prairie, purchased between 100 and 200 acres of woodlands. But board members also carried out larger transactions, including, quote, the proposition from Mr. J.S. Haslam for a loan of $25,000 on lands in the southern part of Saskatchewan. The university's land board also commissioned a solicitor's statement to retain power over lands in newly created adjacent provinces. The solicitor laid out that, quote, when this act, meaning the University Act of Manitoba, was passed, the Northwest Territories was descriptive of a certain port of the Dominion, and I think, therefore, would be applicable to the territory now included in the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan. Unlike the University of Toronto, which received Indigenous land parcels of varying shapes and sizes, Manitoba's university selected Indigenous lands from the grid-like Western Canadian land system, which actually makes them much easier to trace. Developed in the 1870s and 1880s, this system was and is, quote, the world's largest survey grid laid down in a single integrated system. It relies upon a 36 square mile township as its basic unit of survey, creating a checkerboard of these townships across 200 million acres of Western Canada. According to this system's database, the University of Manitoba received land grants divided into 1,052 parcels, as you can see the entries here. And this is searchable at any point. Location data is provided for 545 of these parcels, and you can see the township checkerboard on the right. And I've used a combination of different tools to plot the townships in which the land parcels were located on a Western Canadian land grant system map. And I'll make that a little bit bigger, but it's those red sections, with the one outlier being the grant in Saskatoon given to the University of Saskatchewan. Again, the Native Lands digital website and database allows us to locate the traditional Indigenous territories associated with each parcel. For university lands with available geographic data, the selected lands fell within the territories of the Métis, Cree, Anishinaabe, Sioux, and other Indigenous groups. Meanwhile, the value of these Indigenous lands, and we can see another example, the value of these Indigenous lands, their lease, mortgage, or sale, was significant to establishing the young University of Manitoba. The first principal of Manitoba College, Reverend George Bryce, wrote in 1900 that when the university began, it, quote, was seen that its financial support would become a serious difficulty. This difficulty was remedied through a grant of Indigenous land. By 1900, Bryce notes that, quote, some 6,000 or 7,000 acres of land have been sold, realizing $45,000, so that the present value of the grant may be considered to be between $500,000 and $1 million. The Reverend Bryce's estimate of the value of the land grant was not far off. The financial statements of the University of Manitoba in 1912 revealed that the university's total land sales amounted to $770,000 approximately, with the University Land Board controlling about $675,000 of these funds. A further 64,000 acres of the initial grant remained unsold in 1912. Notably, the other major sum held in trust by the university was the bequest of a Métis lawyer and fur trader, Alexander Isbister. From their inception then, universities functioned as multidimensional organizations whose activities spilled into areas not traditionally associated with higher education. A similar financial arrangement characterized university building in British Columbia. The 1907 University Endowment Act there reserved, quote, up to 2 million acres, the proceeds from which would be used for the betterment of higher education. Yet this property, 70 times the size of Vancouver, was underpopulated by settlers. In 1920, the University of British Columbia surrendered its 2 million acres for 3,000 acres of unceded Musqueam Indigenous territory near Point Grey. These acres are listed in 2023 as, quote, an unincorporated community of 4,000 people named the University Endowment Lands. So taken together, 19th century university land endowments in Canada encompass at least 445,000 to 450,000 acres, which doesn't include the millions of acres these institutions held temporarily, or indeed other institutions, as may be suggested by the UNB quote at the bottom. Warfare with Indigenous peoples and land clearances, sometimes in earlier decades and sometimes ongoing, made those endowments possible. This process, in addition, cannot be separated from similar practices in the United States and elsewhere. Particularly in Canada, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the United States, but also in other colonies of settlement under British rule, public universities in the 19th century developed along similar lines and using similar strategies. The president's inaugural address at the University of Manitoba, for instance, complemented the forms of land administration adopted at American state universities, along with their emphasis on the agricultural and natural sciences. Quote, it was lately my privilege, he told his audience, to visit the great Western universities in the states of Minnesota, Nebraska, and Kansas, and the same features were to be seen in them all. As in Canada, educationalists in the United States trailed advancing armies, claiming the Indigenous spaces seized in colonial warfare. That warfare allowed for institutional land grants, which achieved their most complete expression in the Morrill Act of 1862. Passed by the Lincoln administration as the US Civil War ground on, the Morrill Act supplied each state, quote, not in a condition of rebellion or insurrection, end quote, with 30,000 acres of land per senator and congressional representative. The act mandated that these lands be used to finance at least one institution of higher learning dedicated to agriculture and the mechanic arts. Accordingly, since they had more representatives and less occupied land, populous eastern states would receive far greater grants of land scrip than the sparsely populated western states. In addition, that land scrip could be selected from within one state for the monetary benefit of another. The trustees of Cornell University in New York, for example, chose the lucrative timberlands of Wisconsin for their grant. And you can see a map for that selection and sale in the background. These lands in Wisconsin had once supported various Indigenous nations, including the Ojibwe, Sioux, and Ho-Chunk. Depending on the state's population, lands provided from the Morrill Act to an individual university ranged from 90 to 900,000 acres, and that 900,000 acres was New York. In 1905, the US Department of Agriculture estimated the value of all the various land grant funds at $72 million US. Much of the land granted, moreover, fell into the hands of land speculators. Perhaps the most prolific university land speculator, Gleason Lewis of Cleveland, Ohio, purchased nearly 5 million acres of university land between 1866 and 1873. And much of it was in the form of script that was assigned to about 19 or 20 different states, as you can see here. By 1873, this meant that one man dealt in investments in land large enough to blanket the state of New Jersey. What has remained more obscure, however, is that Lewis's windfall made him the singular beneficiary of those investments in land, which had once supported thousands of Odawas, Kiowas, Apaches, Comanches, Nez Perces, and others. Yet both before and after the Morrill Act, legislative grants of Indigenous land had propped up public universities in the United States. As early as 1619, the British government assigned 10,000 acres to endow Henrico College in Virginia. Warfare with the Powhatan Confederacy, an indigenous alliance of Algonquian-speaking peoples, as well as underpopulation, ensured that this institution was short-lived. Educational land endowments also originated in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, the many swampland acts of various states, and through other state-level appropriations. For instance, between 1839 and 1883, Texan legislators furnished their university system with 2.1 million acres of land. So that's about the size of the original UBC endowment. The University of Texas system and Texas A&M University system still control nearly all of that land, along with the gas and oil found underneath it. As in Texas, educationalists in the Southern Hemisphere found that universities might benefit not simply from Indigenous land, but also from what was below its surface. In South Africa and Australia, for example, university building did not initially require institutional funding via land. While South African universities received various pockets of land, including land gifts from Cecil Rhodes and other mining magnates, university administrators in both countries first used gold profits to sustain universities. And Cecil Rhodes is there in the bottom middle at the University of Cape Town. Yanni Marais, a diamond miner and financier, University of Stellenbosch. Above him is the William Lawrence Bailey Library at the University of Melbourne, another mineral field financier. Walter Watson Hughes is the top middle at the University of Adelaide in South Australia. It's the Sather Tower on the far left. The University of California, Peter Sather is a financier supplier to minefields. And the bottom is the Redpath Museum at McGill, which is sugar baron named in honor of a geologist. So successive wars of Dutch and British colonizers against the Khoikhoi, San, Zulu, and Xhosa peoples had dispossessed them of those gold-producing lands. Meanwhile, the gold rushes of the 1850s in New South Wales and Victoria in Australia had invigorated government revenue streams and enriched mine owners who eventually passed on some of that wealth to endow universities. Yet as the age of gold rushes ended, even Australian and South African institutions agitated for government-awarded land grants. Under the University of Adelaide's Act of Incorporation in 1874, for instance, the new South Australian institution received 50,000 acres of land in the state's distant Tatiara and Veronda districts. While land granting across Australia varied considerably by institution, government officials in Aotearoa, New Zealand employed this method for nearly all of their colonial universities. The majority of land transfer from Maori tribes to European occupiers took place between 1840 and 1890. This was not coincidentally these islands' most significant period of development in higher education. The University of Otago began this process, receiving at least 200,000 acres during Dunedin's own gold rush, about the same size as the University of Toronto. University officers sold timber and gold prospecting rights on these acquired lands. And it's a little blurry, but you can see on the right, Goldfield revenue, which is directly on balance sheets. During the New Zealand Wars of the mid-19th century, New Zealander officials, backed by colonial officials in Melbourne, also assigned Maori land reserves to institutions yet to exist. The University Endowments Act, for one, set aside 10,000 acres of, quote, confiscated land in the province of Taranaki, end quote, in 1868 as Tito Kuaru's war still raged. On this subject, a government memorandum in Wellington noted that, quote, It, meaning the land, has not been exactly defined. The delay has arisen out of the new disturbances which have arrested the sales. This reserve will be defined immediately once quiet is reestablished. Again, in 1871, the University of Canterbury gained 305,000 acres from its provincial government, making it the largest landowner in the province. Added to these lands would be 10,000 acres in Auckland, with a further 30,000 acres a few years later. Much of that terrain would be secured by violence, retained, and then transferred to the University of New Zealand, an examining body that emerged between 1870 and 1874, and then later to Auckland University College, which becomes the University of Auckland. In all of these examples, financing new universities through land made them no small piece of the process of Indigenous dispossession. In fact, these institutions were not only beneficiaries of landed wealth, but also facilitators of its transfer to settlers and speculators. Many farmers and settlement societies were also eager to purchase land. Landholding, the historian Anne Cuthroyce has shown, enfranchised male settlers and formed the basis of their political freedoms. At root, male settler political freedoms in this period then rested upon the lack of freedom and loss of land for Indigenous peoples. In addition, these new universities from America to Australia would come to institutionalize branches of knowledge like agricultural science and engineering, whose products, both intellectual and technological, reshaped their surrounding environments. University agricultural research produced hybridized corn, seed varietals, selected animal breeds, nitrogen fertilizers, mining technology, and a great deal more. These inventions profoundly changed landscapes and ecologies. They also popularized the university for its practical utility and entrenched settlers' relationship to the land, actions that, of course, have had long-lasting political and ecological legacies. According to scholars of Indigenous history, there was not a unified Indigenous philosophy of land that held stable across local tribes, let alone across continents. At odds with the multiplicity of Indigenous knowledge systems, then, were the notions of individualized land tenure and private property that remained remarkably consistent across Euro-American settler societies. This was, of course, unsurprising for settlers that shared a common law heritage. Young American lawyers often carried with them pocket editions of William Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England in the early 19th century. As the scholar Susan Hill claims of the Haudenosaunee context, the European notion of private property was almost an inversion of certain Haudenosaunee beliefs about land. Quote, many Indigenous knowledge holders, she maintains, talk about the idea that the land does not belong to Native people, but rather Native people belong to the land. Universities with land endowments furthered particular forms of agricultural production and expertise because they were born with a vested interest in these activities. One of Toronto's founding professors, Henry Croft, largely opened the field of agricultural chemistry in Canada. As an assessment of Toronto's early professors completed in 1914 described, quote, agricultural chemistry in Canada owes much to Professor Croft. He, more than any other man of eminence in the province, impressed its great practical utility upon our people. He was not less forward in his advocacy of a provincial school of agriculture for the training of farmers and farmers' sons. The Provincial School of Agriculture referred to here was the Ontario Agricultural College, situated in Guelph, but founded as a part of the University of Toronto in 1874. It became a founding college of the University of Guelph almost 100 years later. Agricultural colleges like the OAC developed extension programs, experimental farms, demonstration trains, and by 1900, international reputations that cemented settlers' relationship to land. McGill University and the University of Manitoba replicated these institutes and their programs through their own agricultural colleges. These were respectively named the Macdonald Institute and the Manitoba Agricultural College. Faculty also attempted to universalize the farming knowledge that universities produced. The agricultural reformer and politician Sir George Folds, for instance, supplied all universities in Aotearoa in 1924 with, quote, an account of some investigations I made regarding agricultural education in Canada and America during the past 6 months. Having visited universities across Canada and the United States, he recommended permanent contact be maintained, especially with the Canadian and Californian institutions. An increasingly international philosophy of agriculture could thus be shared, urging settlers to see farming not as a fundamentally local enterprise, but as a domain reducible to universal laws that can be tweaked to fit local conditions. Lands once tended by Indigenous groups and imagined differently by them then were not only a financing tool for settler institutions, but were in turn transformed by these bodies of higher learning. The narrative of the land-grant university, of course, continues into the present, since neither the university nor its role as a landholder have faded. As of 2019, the University of Canterbury still holds 99,000 acres of land, making it one of Aotearoa's top landowners. In the United States, according to Lee and Atone, at least 500,000 acres of unwillingly donated Indigenous lands remain held in trust by 12 or more institutions. In addition, the moral lands, of course, are the endowment lands provided by US states. The University of Texas system, as I mentioned before, still controlled the lands granted to them in the 19th century. Oil was discovered under university lands in 1923. Since then, these Texan institutions have contracted out or conducted their own oil and gas development operations worth billions of dollars in surface and mineral incomes. The University of Texas Investment Management Company is now one of the largest institutional landowners in the world. Furthermore, following the 2008 financial crash, many endowed universities divested from housing markets. Instead, administrators, especially at private American universities, look to restructure their investment portfolios by buying up farmland or by investing in subsidiary land companies. This, quote, global phenomenon of land grabbing, as law professor Olivier Schutter argues, has constituted a green rush of investors towards the buying or leasing of large tracts of farmland and has considerable implications for local communities and target countries. In all of this land accumulation, we hear the echo of an investment strategy for universities that gathered force during the 19th century. While today the role of a land speculator, approximating Gleason Lewis, might be replaced by a subsidiary company, the resort to using land to finance universities relies upon a pattern entrenched almost 150 years before. Settler legislators endowed new universities with Indigenous lands. Some of this land had been purchased or ceded before its reassignment, but much of it remained unceded or was made available through Indigenous peoples' forced removal. I contend that land-grant universities in the Victorian period territorialized Indigenous land is part of the broader territorializing actions of settler colonial states. At the same time, by training those who would govern, by applying social and scientific research to Indigenous peoples and colonial landscapes, and by aiding settler self-understanding in the formation of a civil society, these institutions supplied intellectual infrastructure of empire and later of the nation state. Today, this history also compels us to hold the progressive narrative of university building side by side with its counterpart, the story of Indigenous dispossession that made that progressivism possible. The past landholding practices of institutions like the University of Toronto thus remain an overlooked but key episode in the wider imperial drama of settler Indigenous land contestation. It's an episode that, at the least, encourages us to look beyond the institution's land acknowledgement when we think about the role of landholding in the university's history. As the historian Craig Stephen Wilder has suggested of the American Ivy League universities, these bodies were, quote, imperial instruments akin to armories and forts, a part of the colonial garrison. Examining the territoriality of land-grant universities consequently brings into view one piece of a larger colonial past and one that extends into the present. Thank you. A moment for water.
Yeah. Is it on? Oh, hello, is it on? Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was so rich, so expansive, and I'm sure there are many, many questions. So a reminder for those of you who are here with us today to keep your questions succinct, as I will have to repeat them so that our online audience can hear them as well. And we're also delighted to have Dr. Krista Barkley here to monitor the online questions. So for those of you who are at home or wherever you are not here, you can type your questions into the Q&A function on the Zoom, and we will try and move back and forth between the live audience and the online audience. Before we do so, as you're formulating your succinct questions, I would just like to introduce Dr. Krista Barkley, who is here, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Religion, and she also teaches courses for us in Canadian Studies here at University College, including one on Canada, colonialism, and Indigenous settler relations. She's also, for the last few years, been doing some additional research for us on University College and our colonial context, looking at some of the individuals and other aspects of UC's colonial complicity. Her own research addresses 19th century Canadian history through the lenses of colonialism, public memory, family, and migration. And a book manuscript is in preparation entitled Hudson's Bay Company Families in the 19th Century British World. Krista also has a deep commitment to community-engaged public history, and this includes supporting a digital storytelling project at the K'na-Chi-Wa-Nung Historical Center in Northwestern Ontario, as well as organizing last fall or co-organizing a workshop on museums and public memory on Treaty 3 territory, which brought together First Nation elders, community members, as well as museum professionals and scholars from across North America. So thanks very much, Krista, for joining us. It's wonderful that you're here. And now we will open the floor to questions from our present audience or the online audience. Okay, right now, all of a sudden there is a slew of questions. We'll start with you over there. So please, just speak out loud and I will repeat the question.
What can the University of Toronto do in terms of concrete action to make it up to Indigenous people?
Great, succinct question, which I will just repeat again for our online audience. So what can the University of Toronto do to address these the land grabs that have been made on Indigenous peoples?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and I actually get it quite a bit when I present at universities. And the first thing I'm going to say is slightly, I think, unsatisfying, and I'll try to make up for it by giving you a more satisfying answer after. And the first thing is to say that I'm not a part of the current community at the University of Toronto. So what I suggest, I think, has to be approved by other stakeholders in the community. It's most important that this community represents the people who are currently in it, as much as sort of anyone else. In other sessions that I have, given, some interesting suggestions were things like, could Indigenous populations be considered as, past donors who haven't really been recognized? Could that amount be put towards supporting a community or an Indigenous grant here today? But I think perhaps the most important thing is that the procedures and that there's a discussion on campus about that. I'm sort of the messenger, but I think that the answer has to come from the community itself.
Wonderful, thank you. And you were next, yeah.
Thanks for that really interesting talk. I have two unrelated but very succinct questions. The first sort of follows up on the first question. Can you provide any examples in the contemporary moment of university land back actions? Have there been any parcels returned anymore?
So just
question two is, you mentioned so much about the managing of lands. I'm just wondering who managed or coordinated the actual dispossession of the Indigenous people there, and what kind of resistance would they face?
Okay, great questions. Thank you. I'll try and remember them. This is hard. Okay. The first question are there any examples of, say, land backs that have happened anywhere that we can draw from? And secondly, who were the people responsible for the actual dispossession of the Indigenous peoples from those lands? And was there any resistance?
So to your first question on land back parcels, I'm not aware of a Canadian university that's been able to do that, partly because most of Toronto's lands were already sold by 1860, and they don't actually retain those lands. Other things could be said about, I mean, there's another university boom in the 1960s when other campuses are created and of course gain land, but this is land used in a slightly different sense because students are never on these acres of land. They're used, the university is built out of it rather than built on it. So it's a little bit different. So I'm not sure in the Canadian context that I know of any. I know that it's been contemplated in the American context, and Bobby Lee will know a little bit more about that, and he's presenting at the University Worlds Conference tomorrow. So he'll know a little bit more about that in the American context, but I don't know that any have. As for how this was actually moved or transferred, it depends a lot on the university when this happened. So the University of Minnesota, for instance, the Dakota Sioux War directly preceded the reassignment of those acres. So it was a very close sort of one-to-one. There is a removal of Indigenous people and then a reassignment to a public university. And the same thing happened in New Zealand. In Canada, it's a bit of a longer gap in those, as demonstrated by the Haldeman Treaty or indeed the Toronto Purchase or things like that. But I mean, I think it's still relevant to know basically how institutions use that land. Yeah, thank you.
We're going to shift to some online questions, and then you will be next when we come to the.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So our first online question is from Brian. In any of its reconciliation initiatives, has U of T acknowledged its complicity in Indigenous dispossession?
I have not seen that. And I did look through the websites, especially to provide the slides at the beginning and to look at what land acknowledgements were here. The process of land acknowledgements, as I understand it, first came out of Australia, I should say, partly because of the way land dispossession happens there with a complete extinguishing of legal title to land. But I haven't heard of, oh, where's the online person? I don't know. I have not heard of any acknowledgement.
The next question comes from Chadwick Cowie. Miigwech, for your willingness to share this research with us. I know you give examples on the University of Manitoba, etc. I was wondering if, in relation to the territory you're connecting to, if you've seen any inkling that connects similar understands to institutions such as Western University, as well as affiliate colleges that predate some of the, quote, newer universities, like what was formerly known as Ryerson, now TMU, York, Wilfrid Laurier, etc.
So that's great. I mean, a lot of those are not, so Western is a 19th century foundation. Some of the later ones are not 19th century foundations and don't have access to land in the same way. And indeed, they end up getting government grants first or donors. So I haven't heard of other pieces of that, but we do have scholars in the room who are working on those places and those subjects. So more to come for that.
And Chadwick also has a follow-up. Have you reached out to Michi-Sagig, Anishinaabe Nation, Mississauga Nation, specifically the 5 southern communities of the Mississauga Nation relating to this research and what documents and oral understandings they have themselves relating to land grabs from universities like U of T?
So part of this research was influenced by contact with Haudenosaunee groups and scholars, but not Anishinaabe, no. And I think that would be a good point for me to contact them. And I would welcome that very much. Thank you.
We're going to share this microphone for now. Okay, you are next, please.
Are there any universities anywhere that have begun a wide discussion on campus and with the broader community about this history, or is it really something that outside of your work, broadly, it's just been hidden?
So the question is, are there discussions ongoing at any university, anywhere about these things outside of scholars, anywhere in the world, outside of scholars who are starting to do this work and probably other people as well, but are there these public debates at universities?
So it's a big question. Luckily, I do have an answer for you. There is a movement among scholars in the United States, and that's partly come through NASA, the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. So the University of Ohio in particular has a program called Land Grant Fierce, and it's to look at sort of this history of land grant universities in the US has been one that's been somewhat, triumphalist or positive. And it's a way to look at those universities while also acknowledging the story of Indigenous dispossession and think about how they can bring those two stories together. How can they be faithful to this history that they haven't looked at? How do they develop a new land grant fierce philosophy that might bring them forward or reconcile these two facts? So that's sort of one example. I haven't heard of any in New Zealand. There, of course, have been other university movements, especially related to slavery in the university. So in the University of Cape Town, obviously, there have been protests and defacing of Cecil Rhodes' statue related to certain things there. Brown University, Princeton University, many related to slavery, but I think the question of Indigenous land is ongoing. So.
Okay. Thank you. So we'll have a few more questions from the live audience, if there are any here. Yes, yeah.
I'm curious, most of the lectures were
Great, thank you. So the question is, are there examples of other colonial empires who have established schools, and are there similar kinds of legacies? And do we find any comparative work on what was going on? Just to be succinct about a presentation.
No, that's great. I have a couple answers to that question. The first is that obviously French colonial powers are interested in founding universities. The first iteration of those are actually in the 17th century. You might think of the University of Laval. And it's founded largely in a seminary sense, and is founded by papal bull. So it's directly responsible to the Vatican. A lot of these actually universities are founded through as sort of chartered corporations, through letters patent or through a royal charter. And so they're able to hold land in a distinct way from many of the European universities, where the university is still more a direct extension of the state. So there are French Canadian universities that are founded in a slightly earlier period. The University of Montreal is a 19th century foundation, but I haven't discovered its landholding in the same way. The other thing to say about this is university building, as I discovered doing this broad project, happens in many, many parts of the world in the 19th century. And it's not the only empire to build universities. The Japanese empire will build the imperial universities also in Korea, for example. Germany will build universities in this period as it unifies. France builds universities. In fact, the outlier is Britain. And the reason Britain is an outlier, at least in part, is because Oxford and Cambridge return members to Parliament. And those MPs are not sympathetic to founding new universities, which is why University College London begins as a joint stock company. They crush sort of new attempts to rival them.
Wow, fascinating. You had another question, yeah? Okay, another great question. So this one is speaking more to the kinds of teaching that's happened around the erosion of Indigenous knowledge in the classroom space and through that learning, and what mechanisms can be done to either recover that or to bring Indigenous knowledge back into the classroom, whether it's, the question is, could it be self-standing, should it be incorporated into classes more generally?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think there's sort of some things I can say, but some I don't know all of the curriculum of the various universities today. I'm more of an expert on the 19th and early 20th century. I'll lean on the Australian example. So Bruce Pascoe is an Indigenous author there who wrote a book that largely looked at some of the conflicts between settler and Indigenous knowledge systems. And he argued sort of near the end of his book that you might have to rethink the university, the way knowledge is produced and structured, to really get a better sense or incorporate those ideas, because it's all within a structure or a context that is coming out of a Euro-American sort of frame. But I think actually those conversations are ongoing and need to continue. I'm not sure that I'm the person to provide you with the exact example. Yeah.
We have a question from Richard, who's working on a similar project at UNB. You mentioned that U of T set the precedent of Indigenous land financing for Western universities. I'm wondering how the more Eastern colleges, such as King's Windsor or the College of New Brunswick, influenced the design of U of T's system when it was formed in 1828. And if they didn't, any ideas as to why?
So how much the Eastern universities influenced the development of the University of Toronto? So I think in the sense that they're also involved in these sort of sectarian clashes, they're able to look to one another. But actually different universities, Dalhousie gets its initial money through an American Revolutionary War grant upholding the port of Castine. So they all come from sort of different moments. And the lesson to Toronto is really about the formation or the structure of the place itself as much as its financing. I will say that a lot of the universities are involved initially with training mostly clergymen and teachers. And those are the two things, which means that a lot of Indigenous students do attend these places earlier, not because in the way we would think of it today as a progressive movement, but so that they can return to their communities and proselytize. So that's sort of an interesting thread that continues between many of these places, but their financing is not so alike because they have a slightly different jump. The religious struggles, definitely.
And one more online question from an anonymous attendee. Do you think land acknowledgements have or could have a positive effect on some sort of eventual compensation or remediation efforts? Or are those acknowledgements more of a sanitization of dispossession that actually distract from the real issues?
Thank you for this. So how effective are land acknowledgements, or should more be done? I think from the sort of literature that started with an Australian perspective, I think it's largely agreed that land acknowledgements are important and a good sort of step in the process, but perhaps not the only step that should happen. And events like this and conversations like this, I think are making good on that acknowledgement. There's a moment, I think, here to listen to Indigenous communities and not to maybe put forward all your ideas, but to take a step back. And I think that might be a way forward. But I certainly think you can, I started with a land acknowledgement and slightly reformed it to acknowledge something about the university. Not because I think you need to adopt that, but I think it might start off a conversation here.
Shall we move back to it? Okay, there's someone right at the back of the room to start with. Yeah, everyone turns. It's great. So I actually didn't quite catch the last part of it, but what I understood, the door was opening, was that your interest in the second part of the talk, which is looking at how the university reproduces knowledge and ideas beyond the university itself. Is that what? Yeah, okay, so great. So how the university then, it's funded by these financiers and takes away the land, but then reshapes our knowledge of social space and what the implications are of that. So to elaborate on that.
Yeah, there's a lot in there, which is great. So I'm going to try and answer most of it, I hope. So the first thing to say is that many of these universities are mandated to focus on agriculture and the mechanic arts. They don't do that from the very beginning, but they slowly sort of unlock the grip of the classics and the liberal arts on higher education that for a long time had been the sort of dominant study. So there's a class-based dimension, and most of the academics at places like the University of Toronto or University of Sydney or University of Otago are British and Irish to begin with. And there's a real struggle, sort of a class dynamic between this sort of agricultural community and this maybe more upper middle class professor about what kind of education fits within a new university. And it ends up for a period, siding eventually maybe with some of that agricultural research. And the way that happens is through things like experimental farms and demonstration trains. And those were ways for the university to actually put it on the road. So there's something in Iowa called the Corn Gospel Train. And you put professors on the train and you send them out into rural districts, and farmers enter and they learn about the various ways of farming, of seed varietals, and of creating, sort of new corn breeds that will basically change the landscape. So there is quite a broad reach. The other thing to say is that universities, it's not a foregone conclusion that they survive this period. There are many, many more universities founded that could really be sustained. So about after 1850, they stopped failing. And that was one of my big questions. Sydney College, Australia College, these initial colleges in Australia, for example, completely fold. So this process of reaching out to the community and of really bringing citizens in so that you can acquire state appropriations or state financing is an important mode and means that that agricultural dimension makes it into the community really that much faster. And the final point I will say on the sort of international circuit of that knowledge is come the time of the First World War, and the development of the civic or the red brick universities in Britain, so the University of Manchester, University of Birmingham, they're very interested in that agricultural research and that engineering research. They actually send people out to Canadian and American and Australian universities to learn about things like engineering and agricultural science. And during the First World War, a lot of that knowledge is sort of sucked into Europe. So it really does move in significant ways that surprised me, I think, as I researched this topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, question here.
Less on the content itself and more maybe the methods. In your research, was there an acknowledgement for like the colonial nature of archival collections, like in the selecting or ordering of records? And was there other research methods that were adopted to compensate for these gaps in archival literature, like you said, like contacting a funding or
Thank you. Great question. So this one is about methods. So is there any recognition in the work that you've done of the fact that the archive itself is colonial? And then how do you address that by maybe triangulating or doing different kinds of things to address some of those gaps or problems with the archive itself?
So that's a really good question. And I think the first thing to say is that I sort of knew of archives from various readings during much of my sort of doctoral generals examinations and others, that these archives wouldn't maybe show me as easily what I had wanted to see, and that they were themselves expressions of a particular form of power. And that meant actually that I ended up doing more with financial records and with other records that I didn't think I would look at the beginning, to make sure that I wasn't taking just administrators' perspectives. I mean, universities are often good at producing paper, but you needed that sort of financial backstop to really test, was this thing implemented in the way that I expected? The other thing I knew going in was that a lot of Indigenous peoples may not go by a particular name where I would recognize them as Indigenous or mixed race students. And that was very helpful for identifying different individuals. In the United States, you can often reach out to a historical society and be put in touch with a reputable knowledge holder. And at times they guided me through the archives in the way that they would see it. And that's a strategy that I would recommend to non-Indigenous students.
Thank you. So we'll take one more question here before I'll check to see if there's online, but go ahead. Yeah, please.
This is a question about the University of Toronto itself and perhaps other Canadian philosophy of land engineering impacted how University of Toronto or other universities landscape and use their lands. So I'm like thinking, for example, like the creek behind us that's been covered, but that's on the university land. How has that impacted the way that universities use their lands?
Right. So the question is, how has University of Toronto, other Canadian, perhaps even American universities, how have they treated the lands that they have acquired, and how maybe is that knowledge that they were teaching in the classroom, there's an expression of that in the landscape itself?
This is an interesting question because it brings us sort of right up to today. I would say initially a lot of these places weren't necessarily, some of them were urban, but many of them had rural sites as well. And so the way they shaped the environment was by building those farms that I talked about, or building you know, these other sort of experimental stations. So that was sort of the first way that they have done that. Many universities, the sort of second big wave of growth really comes in the 1960s. And that's when universities start to get all of these satellite campuses. And they're even doing that, of course, on a global level. If you can see universities having satellite campuses in the Middle East or in China or in elsewhere. So that's sort of one way. I'm not an urban planner in the sense of telling you about this sort of landscape design, but I think that they did shape the landscape. Just, I know a little bit more about it in the earlier period, but we can talk about it more.
Yeah, online we have a question: how does university land dispossession differ from other forms of land dispossession in Canada in the 19th and 20th centuries?
So this is a good question. I can answer it for different nation states a little bit differently. I mean, the one thing to say is that in the American context, which is sort of important or distinct also and helpful to the Canadian context, is that it's not so distinct. So the Morrill Act actually occurs in the same year as the Pacific Railway Act in America, and indeed the Homestead Act. So that is a huge land grab all at once, which is really only made possible by war. This is also true in some instances in the Canadian context. I mean, we haven't often thought of war, including colonial warfare, as important to acquiring land, but it's significant to university land dispossession in particular. Having a war, whether that's an Indigenous settler war or the American Revolutionary War, which makes academics come into Canada, I think is still an important one. I don't think the process of university land dispossession is distinct necessarily from other parcels, as you can see with the sort of Manitoba Western Canadian land grant system. I do think the process of managing that land is often distinct. So having it managed by a bursar and then a college council and then another body, this creation of multiple bodies to manage that land is something that they do in distinctive ways. Thank you.
Another online question: when we think about designing spaces, I'm guessing they're referring here to specifically university spaces, how can we acknowledge and reflect this history in a positive way?
So that sort of connects to some of the other questions I think I've had already. And again, I'm going to say a little bit that I think you could have physical representations or acknowledgement on campus. So I was a doctoral student at Princeton University, and the outcome of their Princeton and Slavery project was to commission an African-American artist to do a sort of a tableau or a sculpture that commemorated a land sale that happened at the home of a president of Princeton. And I thought that that was very powerful as a reminder of that transaction. That's something that could be contemplated. But again, I mean, after this, I will go back to the University of Cambridge for a while. And I think it's important that students and faculty, and indeed, you know, knowledge holders outside the community are able to participate in a process. Something doing the history of universities has taught me is that there's a lot of power in procedure. Who decides the procedural rules is extremely important, not just the outcome. You can raise awareness for something, but if you don't know how someone is voting before the meeting, you make loss. That's all.
Okay. Great, thank you. Any other questions? No, it's great. Yeah, you were next, thanks. So the question is, were there other intermediaries involved? So churches were mentioned at several points, but other ones like mortgage brokers or insurance companies and so on.
Yes, so I mean, that's great, and thank you. Certainly churches are the original. I mean, higher education is associated with the church from the get-go, and disestablishment is what largely takes place over the 19th century. So churches, of course, remain involved in higher education throughout the 19th century and, of course, today. Even defining that relationship between church and state happens in different ways. We might think in the American context of the Dartmouth College case in 1819, two Dartmouths exist for a period in time, the university and the college, and it's a Supreme Court case that defines the private theological college against the public university, and this happens in different ways. So the churches, I mean, are extremely important also to creating many different institutions across Canada. Banks, they do hold all of these mortgages, land sales, and obviously, as the example of Queen's University shows, their collapse is also significant to universities. I haven't found evidence of, bankers directly playing a role in university governance, but they're certainly a part of the infrastructure. One thing that does happen in all these societies is many of your institutions are built together. So national libraries, botanical gardens, universities, they're all a part of this sort of civil society infrastructure that emerges in this period. And those institutions depend on one another. Yeah, I think that's
great. Thank you. I think there was a question around here. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for your talk. So I was struck by a section at the end of your talk where you're speaking about mining companies or owners of mining companies and how they become benefactors to universities with endowments. And so thinking about those longer histories and different ways that Indigenous land dispossession is connected to universities. Yeah. So specifically to U of T, in your research, were you able to learn more about some of the extractive industries connection to university in the late 19th and early 20th century? Because I know that's what you focus on, and there was a lot going on with mining specifically in Northern Ontario between that time as well.
Yeah. Great, thanks so much. So the question is about the history of mining and other forms of extraction on the land, which were mentioned, but to elaborate on some of that, thinking also about the present and those ongoing practices, but since your focus is on the historical, maybe to elaborate on some of that.
Yeah, thank you for that question and also the chance to elaborate. In the sort of current moment, a lot of those mining movements are often seen as divestment activism against oil and gas or divesting from fossil fuels for university endowment. So that's usually how I see the expression happening. But in the 19th century, and in fact, the 20th century, it's actually the gold rushes that have quite a prominent role to play in founding universities. There's a place like, well, the different places, University of Sydney, University of Melbourne, University of California, University of Cape Town, University of Fitzwilliam, all gain money from various mining and mineral strikes, often because governments can charge excise and licensing fees on gold, and then they get that cash that's so hard to get and often comes through Indigenous land. In Canada, UBC has that role as well, but not so much in Ontario. Ontario has the Porcupine gold rush, but it's a different type of mining. It matters a lot whether it's alluvial mining, so you can literally, go and pick up gold, or it's deep lead mining, which is much farther into the ground and harder to get. So I'm not 100% sure for Toronto, but certainly alluvial mining, because of its role in the international economy. I mean, it's the closest thing you can to picking up money off the ground, matters to university building. And I also write on this subject because the extractive industries are so important. In the places I am now, last thing on this, the Bite professorships at Oxford are named, in fact, for a mining family. So even our sort of historical knowledge is shaped by extractive industries. Thank you.
Thank you.
A question from the chat here. Have you encountered any obstructionism or pushback during your research by any of the implicated institutions, beyond simply universities, but also religious organizations or other stakeholders who may want this history sanitized?
Ooh. Thank you for that question. It's a slightly difficult question. When I started this research, I don't think it was pre-pandemic. And actually, as I've said to a few of you, I'm not sure you could have done this archival research during or post the pandemic. It hadn't been, universities weren't quite looking as self-critically at their own histories. So there wasn't a way necessarily to see me as perhaps a threat, I suppose. So I went to university archives in Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, and Canada to gather these records. And at the University of Toronto, you can also see these records. They're available to you. And many of them are sort of older, and I didn't encounter resistance. If it's sort of the more present day things, then you can't necessarily see maybe private Ivy League university records from their investment management companies. That's quite hard. The University of Texas is very, you can look at it online. They're very open about the lands that they own. I think that maybe is a more present day thing. In the 19th century, other than when I give talks, I don't really encounter much resistance. You guys have been lovely.
So far, so good. Yeah. Okay. Do you have another? Okay, we have just a few minutes left for a couple more questions before we bring this to a close. Are there any other questions? Yeah.
I've done that to myself, haven't I?
So the question, I'll just repeat, is when there has been some resistance, what has it been about?
Yeah, so it's a good question. Sometimes it's been about, when the land is ceded or sold, or whether it represents sort of an unceded assignment. The unwillingly donated part is also a part that my colleague Bobby Lee and Tristan Atone get for their project. I'd say there's some critical questions about that. I don't think, nothing is springing to mind, just maybe more critical questions about this project, and also about perhaps whether it matters as much as other types of investment today. So does it matter if you get donations from, say, a Russian oligarch? Does that matter more? One could say that you could keep both of these things in mind, but that's sort of how it's weighted, what to prioritize, seem to be the kind of questions that I get. But on the whole, I think it's been fine. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any last questions?
Yeah, this reminds me of, this reminds me of the meaning of money. So that was your purpose. And so the origins of funds or material goods that we use to do whatever we do. And I think your comment was really interesting there. What does it mean? Not only that, this gets framed as sort of stolen land or dispossessed land, but how? I don't know. Can you think? I'm struggling to find words. But can you think that through a little bit longer on words? That if the money is coming from despicable people or it's coming from dispossession, does that mean that the institution is necessarily tainted and it's irrecoverable, or is there something?
Okay, so the question is really does it matter where the money comes from and how we think about those monies, so the bad actors or whatever, and should we just give up? Thinking about these kinds of questions is how you ended it, which is not where I want to end it, but you can ignore that last part. But just thinking about where the origins of money and thinking about how these things and maybe even their persistence. Yeah.
So it's a good question, and I'm going to think it through with you more. And if I go in the wrong direction, just tell me if I'm not getting the point that you're hoping. I think the accusation comes in part from whether institutions are making, money that we might see as, disreputable, in a sense, laundering it and making it seem more reputable, or being given to a good cause in a way. And I don't think it's not that the institutions have to remain tainted, but there are things that they could do to maybe repair reparation or repair that relationship with the communities that they have damaged. I don't think we should stop talking about it, but perhaps I seem like the person who would say that, having given you a talk on that. But I certainly think today, I mean, the question I get there from university administrators is, how do I get, big philanthropic donations that are, perhaps not, in a sense, immoral or disreputable? And it does create that sort of crunch, but it's not one that I think we shy away from just because the question is a difficult question. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah. Great answer. And the undue pressure that I think is posed often by these kinds of investments as well is hugely problematic, right? All right, we have time for a last question. If there's anyone here in the audience who would like to ask a last question, please.
I also like the connection between the importation of European science and the way that science transformed the land. And in some sense, it removes the memory of the original inhabitants of the land. I want to know if that was a purposeful intent. People like Croft have a purposeful intent to actually remake the land, but in a way to remove the memory of the original inhabitants, so people like us would be able to have this discussion.
So the question is around the new knowledges that were being taught around land and its development and agricultural development and so on. Was that deliberative in terms of the erasure of Indigenous knowledge? Was that part of the intent of what they were doing back then?
In some cases, yes. More often it's expressed, at least at these universities, as things, and you can look at the work of Rebecca Woods, who's actually in the History of Science department here, which she looks at animal breeds and their importation. And the thing that she's really strong on there is just that, I mean, it's seen as a sort of British is best or a European is best, and that an Indigenous way is not as good as this. So we need these kind of herd animals, including the importation of sheep and cattle from Europe, just simply because we believe that they are superior. And of course, the great problem with that is a lot of those herd animals are not suited to these environments. And the point made about that today is in places like Australia and New Zealand, they eat forms of vegetation that of course are important to maintaining the climate. So it's sort of a slight variation on that, but amounts to big climate and ecological results.
Great, thanks. Oh, one more question. Okay, perfect, go for it, yeah.
Has there been any evidence that you've seen of universities acknowledging land dispossession historically during the 19th and 20th centuries? So as these processes were ongoing, were universities actually acknowledging that this was happening?
Yes, for sure. Because I mean, many of them, they're very small institutions in this time period. I mean, the first graduate of the University of Wisconsin is the only graduate. It's a graduating class of one. So they're really, I mean, professors often serve also as administrators. And as at the University of Toronto, the professors are engaged in managing the land. I mean, I think that would seem very strange today. Sometimes people ask me, like, from the perspective of this sort of behemoth 20th century college, how is this project sort of possible? And I describe it more like they're sort of like the size of high schools. Modern day high schools spread very far apart. But yes, they're absolutely involved in the process and are aware.
Great, thanks so much. So to bring this to a close, I'll invite Principal Marcus Stock to come up and say some final remarks. And as he approaches the podium over there to make his comments, I can't not say how wonderful this has been and how deep and broad your knowledge is, and how wonderful it's been to hear both about us here at the college and at the university, but also internationally. It's just phenomenal what you've been able to do in the research, and I'm just that impressed. So I'm not supposed to say any of these remarks, so I'm just going to stop now and I'll turn it over to Principal Stock.
Thank you very much.